Well, I'm glad to see you back. This is Module 4, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. So let's just actually get started. Okay, so the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, also referred to as the TRC, labored from 2008 to 2015 to document the history and lasting impacts of the Canadian Indian residential school system on Indigenous students and their families. In 2015, they published two documents that I'm going to provide in this module. I'm also going to make a recommendation that helped me learn about reconciliation. I joined an online reading group that met every week with each reading group member taking turns reading from the TRC report called What We Have Learned Principles of Truth and Reconciliation. By reading the text with colleagues, I had the opportunity to experience the text in a collective that also created the learning space for reflection for action. You can make your own online reading group, or even better, meet outside as a land activity to read the report. Another text that can be read collectively is the Truth and Reconciliation Commission of Canada Calls to Action. I will be speaking more about these calls to action in this module. As I talk about residential schools, I would like you to reflect on connections to citizenship and language learning in Canada to the pedagogical model of residential schooling. Both of these texts are linked in the Works Cited section for Module 4 in the main document, also on um, the YouTube channel that is linked to GatherTown and in GatherTown as well. Okay, so assimilatory practices through Canada's social institutions impacted and continue to impact newcomers. However, policies for assimilation have had the greatest impact on Indigenous peoples. Confederation in 1867 came at a great cost for Indigenous peoples and is the ongoing reality of settler colonialism in Canada. The settlers saw themselves as the great white Christian saviors who would save the Indigenous peoples from themselves. The entrenchment of superiority was so great that the settlers could not even recognize any contributions by the hosts of Turtle Islands, the Indigenous people. Instead, Confederation made official the Canadian government's categorization of Indigenous peoples as an Indian problem that they sought to realize and resolve through the elimination of Indianness. The Indian Act of 1876 imposed requirements for full citizenship of education, literacy, and Western moral character through enfranchisement on the Indigenous peoples. Enfranchisement meant Indigenous peoples had to forfeit their Indian status, meaning their Indigenous identity, culture, and community membership in exchange for the right to vote, purchase alcohol, and land. The Indigenous peoples did not wish to participate in enfranchisement, which the Government of Canada determined as a threat. Referred to as the Indian problem, the government believed that forced assimilation into Euro Canadian culture was necessary to civilize and moralize Indigenous peoples. Duncan Scott, Duncan Campbell Scott of Indian Affairs said in 1918, I want to get rid of the Indian problem. I do not think, as a matter of fact, that the country ought to continuously protect a class of people who are able to stand alone. Our objective is to continue until there is not a single Indian in Canada that has not been absorbed into the body politic, and there is no Indian question and no Indian department. That is the whole object of this bill. The government developed systems of assimilation with widespread public support through residential schools, and the Indian Act as a nationwide response to solve the Indian problem. Ingrained in cultural superiority and ethnic prejudice, Canada's goal to eliminate Indianness is our linguistic legacy of residential schools. As government funded, these schools required Indigenous youths to learn English, with a small cohort learning French, depending on the region. The youth also had to adopt Christianity. They could not speak their native languages, nor practice their traditions, and they faced harsh punishments for noncompliance. Through public exposure, there are many missing children, unmarked graves, supported by testimony and documented histories by the TRC, Indigenous community organizations, and academics. The cultural re education of residential schools removed Indigenous youth from their families and forced them to live in substandard conditions, often accompanied by sexual abuse. They endured long term separations from their families as well. The focus on linguistic education was a result of the government's realization of the strong connection between language and culture. By erasing language, the government believed it could dissolve cultural identities, especially as they knew that Indigenous peoples' cultural histories depended on intergenerational oral transmission. As a result of the connections of violence to Indigenous languages in residential schools, many Indigenous youth became incapable of communicating in their native languages when they returned home. The removal of linguistic heritage was the government's weapon to break Indigenous communities. It is morally intolerable to ignore the cultural devastation of residential schooling. Lasting until 1996, the goal was to assimilate Indians into society through residential schooling. So, the purpose of the TRC was to make contributions to truth, healing, and reconciliation with respect to the harms inflicted by the residential schooling policy. As said by Justice Murray Sinclair, reconciliation is about forging and maintaining respectful relationships. There are no shortcuts. Replacing the industrial schools that were to westernize Indigenous youth with westernized labor skills in the later part of the 19th century, the residential school model sought to eradicate Indigenous language and culture. The TRC has called it a policy of cultural genocide. Amendments to the Indian Act in 1920 mandated that all Indigenous children between ages 7 to 16 years attend residential schools. In 1933, upon the forced surrender of legal custody by Indigenous parents of their children, their legal guardianship was assumed by principals at residential schools. Approximately 150,000 Indigenous children between the ages of 4 to 16 years experienced forced removal from their families, language, and culture to learn the colonial languages of English or French and become acculturated into the colonial identity of language, religion, and gendered occupations. Okay, so as part of its mandate, the TRC produced a report and a list of 94 calls to action in 2015. Under titles of child welfare, education, language and culture, health, justice, and reconciliation, the 94 calls to action are to redress the legacy of residential schools and advance the process of Canadian reconciliation. Calls to action 93 and 94, respectively, apply to the Discover Canada Citizenship Guide and Citizenship Oath. I will now play a recording of Marie Sinclair reading these calls to action.
93. We call upon the federal government in collaboration with the National Aboriginal Organizations to revise the information kit for newcomers to Canada and its citizenship test to reflect a more inclusive history of the diverse Aboriginal peoples of Canada, including information about the treaties and the history of residential schools.
Okay, now number 94.
We call upon the Government of Canada to replace the oaths of citizenship with the following. I swear or affirm that I will be faithful and bear true allegiance to Her Majesty Queen Elizabeth II, Queen of Canada, her heirs and successors, and that I will faithfully observe the laws of Canada, including treaties with Indigenous peoples, and fulfill my duties as a Canadian citizen.
I can report that
94. We call
the
upon the Government of Canada to
update to
replace
the
the
oath
oaths of
has been
citizenship with the
completed.
following.
However, the guide remains in place. It informs the test, and we must teach the guide to support our learners' goals in achieving citizenship. There are ways we can support our learners and actively work towards reconciliation in the teaching of this guide. Modules 7 and 8 will give us pedagogical tools to take action. So I'd like to thank you. And I did also put an activity which you can find in the main document that will support this module. And of course, I do want to make sure you have access to these references, which are in the main document, along with their hyperlinks. And I hope to see you in Module 5, where we talk about Discover Canada.